Alright, so in today's video I'm going to be doing a quick list of the best books that I've read so far in 2021. First up we have The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. So this is the first book in Anne Rice's Mayfair Witches trilogy. This is a huge gothic masterpiece that tells the story of the Mayfair family, who are witches, and their connection with a mysterious entity called Lasher, who seems to be connected to both of their fortunes and their miseries. I really enjoyed this book. It's got everything that I like about Anne Rice dialed up to like 11. It's elaborate, it's complex, there's huge, aspects of mythology and world building and massive backstories for characters and complex, weird relationships. It's overwritten in places, but it's just so good and excessive in the best kind of way. I think if you don't like Anne Rice and her style, you probably won't like this book, but if you really dig the kind of vibes of Anne Rice, then The Mayfair Witches is just like the most extreme and, in my view, best form of that. I especially like her world building in this book, and the Mayfair family tree and those chapters where we go back in time and see the families through the generations. I think she manages to do that in a way that keeps things engaging, because every generation and every different time period that she's looking at does feel very unique and different, which can be quite a hard thing to do, to capture the essence of various places and times without just relying on, conventions and tropes of those times. I think Rice does a really good job of keeping things interesting and unique across the time periods that she discusses. I think that's mainly because she just loves history and bringing what she learns about history into her books, and you can really see her doing that in The Mayfair Witches. I also found out recently that the Mayfair Witches trilogy was only originally intended to be one book, the first book, and that sort of made me feel a lot better about the series, because if you watch my reviews of the series, you'll know, kind of typical with the pattern with these books, as they progressed for me I found that they got progressively worse, and the last book I didn't really like at all. So finding out that actually the first book was meant to be a standalone book with just a very ambiguous ending has made me appreciate it a lot more, because now I won't feel as bad when I go back and read this book, because I can just kind of see it as, here's where the story ends, and we don't have to go back to those other two books ever again. Next up we have City of Night by John Rechy. City of Night tells the story of a young hustler who is drifting from city to city across America and his experiences in the gay subculture of the 1950s. What I like about this book is the atmosphere that it crafts. The name kind of suggests exactly what that atmosphere is. It's sort of late night, dirty back alley of a city. It's dark, it's dangerous, you're kind of depressed and probably quite hazy in your head with alcohol, and it really does capture that theme really well. Those cold winter evenings in the city, the loneliness, the isolation, even though you're surrounded by people. All these things are just captured really well in this book. And even though it's quite a long book, this atmosphere never gets too depressing. One thing that's really good about the story is that as the protagonist moves from city to city, every city has a slightly different feel to it, and in every city there are new characters with new problems, whether it's other hustlers, drag queens, clients that the hustler has. All of them are very different in very interesting ways. And so it's a really good episodic kind of story, but with an overarching narrative as well, and a very good atmosphere. It's not just a good LGBT novel, it's just a very good novel in and of itself as well. Next on the list we have Juliet by the Marquis de Sade. So Juliet is the companion novel to a much shorter and better known novel, Justine. Justine and Juliet are actually not only sister novels, but sister characters within the novels. Justine is a pure, virtuous soul who, because she's pure and virtuous, suffers a lot in life at the expense of others. And Juliet is a corrupt, evil soul, and because she is evil, she gets rewarded throughout life, and Juliet focuses on her story. Now this was definitely a difficult read. It's 1,200 pages of filth, of ranting about philosophy and religion and morality, and in some cases it just gets overbearing, either because the rants are too much or because the gross sex is too much. Nevertheless, it's still in my view, a masterpiece of kind of perverted imagination. Sade really doesn't pull any punches when it comes to that kind of stuff. And also his rants sometimes are quite interesting, especially for the time period that he was writing in. It's quite easy to turn around and say you're an atheist these days, but back when Sade was saying that, that certainly wasn't the case. And what I like about Sade in general is that he's able to combine all of these things that are usually very separate from each other, kind of academic philosophy stuff and pornography and gothic horror and just comic humor, he manages to pull all of these things together, and somehow it manages to work. And I don't think that, you know, many people could make that work, but Sard really does. I can't say I would recommend Juliet as a book to begin with Sard, because it is just ridiculously long, but I do think that it is worth, if you ever want to really just wrestle with Sard's work, it's worth reading at some point, especially because Juliet is certainly the more interesting sister, because, you know, Justine is kind of, you know, placid and everything bad happens to her. So it is interesting to kind of read the other side, but I appreciate that it is quite a big book, and it can be quite taxing to read, both because of the rants and because it's kind of gross at times. Next up on the list we have The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. So I reviewed this one very recently on the channel, so I won't talk about it too much, but I really enjoyed this book as I enjoyed it the very first time that I read it, back when I was in school. The God of Small Things is a very tragic family story that centres around a tragic event that happened when the protagonist was a young girl, and the story is told out of time and order, going back from the time of the tragedy to the present day, where she's returned to her hometown and she's meeting her twin brother again, who she hasn't seen since this tragedy occurred. It's a very sad book, but it's also very interesting in the way that it's structured and in the way that it's written. Roy actually tries to tell the story from the perspective of a child, and so she writes in a way that reflects the childhood thought process. So for instance, she combines words in a way that if you're a kid and you hear a parent say two words together really quickly and you might put them together, she does things like that. She capitalizes words that don't need capitalization, but because those words might have significance to a child, they're given this capitalization. And lots of other things she does as well, which are really interesting. And there are lots of other things she does as well to reflect the kind of child thought process in the book. But just outside of that kind of postmodern structural and, you know, fancy writing stuff, it's also just a story that will hit you like a ton of bricks. It's very tragic, it's very sad, and the way that the story is told adds to the impact of that tragedy, because it ends on a very optimistic note, focusing in on a time when things were quite happy for some of the characters, but obviously we know that that's not how the story goes. So yeah, excellent book, and I'm really glad that I reread it this year for my nostalgia reviews. Next up we have Poems by Emily Bronte. So after all that Wuthering Heights, you might be a bit sick of me banging on about Emily Bronte, but I promise there'll be no Wuthering Heights in this video because we're done with that, and I don't think I need to talk about how much I like that book anymore. But I did decide to pick up Emily's poetry, and I did really enjoy them. Like Emily Dickinson and Lord Byron and the other poets that I've been reading lately, Bronte is another example of a poet that's really making me reassess my thoughts on poetry. So only a small collection of Emily Bronte's poetry was published in her lifetime. In fact, it was combined with the poetry of her sisters as well. There was just one book that had all three of their poems in. But the collection I have is a collection of her full set of poems, so her unpublished poems as well. And a lot of her poems focus on a fantasy world that she created with her sister Anne, Gondal. The Gondal poems are really beautiful pieces of literature, focusing on kind of the beauty of nature, friendship, war, violence, and death. It can get a bit repetitive at some times, I will say, but even though Bronte is a bit limited in the themes that she tackles, she does write very beautifully, and the poems are generally a joy to read. Also, one thing that I really enjoyed while reading the poems was a lot of these poems are fragments from the Gondal world. So it could be a poem that's telling you about a significant event that happened recently in Gondal, or a song that someone is singing in Gondal. And so you have kind of these fragments of poetry from this big complex world that she created. But because the actual, you know, general narrative of that world is lost, we don't have those documents, you're left to kind of piece together the history of this world from the fragments. So it's almost like archaeology in a sense, that you've got these documents that tell you about these events, but you can't exactly piece everything together, which just adds an interesting dimension to reading the poems, because not only are you just appreciating the poetry and the symbolism and the language, you're also trying to work out, you know, what is going on in this world that Bronte and her sister created. So yeah, some very beautiful poetry from Emily Bronte, and she has definitely cemented herself, for me at least, as my favourite of the three Bronte sisters. Next up we have one of the weirdest things that I read this year, and that is Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. Now this is a bloody odd book. It's essentially just a collection of rants and ravings that Burroughs wrote while he was completely off his face on heroin, so much so that he actually said that you can take this book up at any chapter and begin from there, because it doesn't actually have an order because it is just basically the collections of a crazy man. And so that does make it hard to read, because sometimes you're just like, what on earth is happening here? You have characters who morph into other characters, names constantly changing. There's no concrete storyline really in the story at all, aside from some recurring characters who seem to be moving around, but you don't really know what's going on outside of that. It can go from being quite hideous and dark and gruesome to then being quite funny and back again. As an example of this, there is a bit of the book where there's I don't know if it's a thing that happens or something that gets talked about, but there's a person whose backside like begins to talk and becomes sentient and starts to take over the body of the person. And you know, that sounds ridiculous and funny, but then the person's mind like starts to shut down and the backside like takes over the whole body until the person is just a pair of eyes that's completely passive and has been taken over by this other disgusting creature. And it's the way that he writes it is almost terrifying and horrific by the end, but it starts off really funny and stupid. And that also kind of sums up a lot of Burroughs. He has this really gross out humor, but then takes it to some really dark places that you just don't expect. Also in the book is an interesting essay that he wrote on drug addiction and his view that drug addiction is essentially a disease and should be treated like a disease rather than as something people should be, you know, punished for. There is also a film of this book that sort of is an adaptation of the book, but is also an adaptation of Burroughs' life, which kind of makes sense because the book is his ravings. So it's kind of an interesting film. But I would say that the film is not a very good adaptation of the book, because I think it focuses too much on the kind of depressive and dark side of the story and misses out on a lot of those lighter moments. And it certainly tones down a lot on the sexual side of William Burroughs' work, which is a big aspect of it. So I didn't find the film to be an amazing one, and I would definitely say that you should read the book rather than watch the film, because if you watch the film and think that's weird, just wait until you read the book. It's light years weirder than anything in that film. Next on the list we have The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. The Garden of Eden tells the story of a rather bougie couple who have just been married and they're touring around on their honeymoon in Europe, and their relationship starts to turn kind of strange when the female in the relationship starts to play around with her gender and become more and more androgynous and eventually masculine, and this starts to have an effect on the man, who then becomes more feminine. It's a very strange story, and the characters' motivations are very hard to pin down, but it's also a very interesting story that has a lot of interesting things to say about gender roles, masculinity, femininity, and all that kind of stuff. It's also just very interesting for me because it's the first Hemingway story that I read, and it kind of shattered a lot of the myths around Hemingway that I assumed. So things like him being a kind of manly man that focuses on, you know, male issues and nothing else. Because this book kind of certainly does focus on masculinity, but it also focuses much more broadly on androgyny. It's also quite a controversial book because it was edited down from, I believe, like an 800-page manuscript, and the actual book itself is only about 200 pages. But despite those debates that we can get into about is this a real Hemingway novel or did the editor ruin it by cutting it down quite heavily, it's still a really good book, and I would still recommend reading it, even if you think it doesn't really count as a Hemingway novel because of the way the editors significantly cut a lot of the material. It's a strange story, it's an interesting story, and definitely worth the read. And now we have Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. So Brighton Rock is a thriller story set in 1930s Britain. It follows this gang led by a, I think, 16 or 19-year-old guy called Pinky, and the gang have recently murdered an ex-member, and they've started to be investigated by a young woman called Ida, who befriended the man that they killed just before they murdered him. Essentially, the story focuses on the disintegration of this group, of Pinky, as you know, his kind of world collapses around him as the net closes in. Now, this novel does have some religious themes in it to do with Catholicism, although I can't say I really noticed them when I was reading it. I just thought it was an excellent thriller. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it does have things like cities and guns, so it's not entirely timeless, but it didn't feel dated, and I found it very easy to read and engage in. And it was just a really fun story as well. One thing that I like about this book is that even though it does have these deeper themes, those themes don't, you know, overpower the novel. A lot of the time when you get novels that have religious themes or moral themes or those kinds of things, they can tend to overpower the story and the characters in a way that either makes contrived characters who are just kind of representing different aspects of morality, or you have characters who end up being mouthpieces for the kind of political or religious views of the writer, or a plot that's just a bit contrived. But I didn't think that was the case with Brighton Rock. It's just a really good story with some really interesting things to investigate if you want to. And so for me, that's a pretty good book, because you can get the enjoyment and you can get the analysis and you can do whichever one you want. Moving quite back in time now for the next one, we have The Tempest by Shakespeare. So I've actually had The Tempest on my radar for a very long time, ever since I was in school, when we were stuck with Romeo and Juliet, because of course, and the other class, or one of the other classes, was doing The Tempest. I was always really jealous of this other class, and it was a completely irrational kind of jealousy, because I had no idea what The Tempest was about, aside from like some vague references. I knew it was a bit more magical than, say, his other plays, but I was just really envious of the class. And I never read The Tempest, even at the time, but I always wanted to. And finally this year, as part of my Shakespeare reading challenge, I did read The Tempest, and it was worth the wait. I really enjoyed it, and I think it might be one of my favourite Shakespeare plays ever. I think what I like about The Tempest is that it's kind of a hodgepodge of all of Shakespeare's best bits. You've got the magic surrealist comedy of something like Midsummer Night's Dream in here. You've got the kind of political intrigue stuff of the history plays, but they're not as boring as the history plays. You've got the tragedy elements as well, with the kind of family kind of drama in the middle of the story. And you've got your romance as well. So you've just kind of got everything there, all put together in one play. And somehow it manages to come together. It's fun, entertaining, and it's also got some fantastic characters like Prospero and Caliban and Ariel. You know, it's just a really good play, and I really enjoyed it. I haven't actually seen a production of it yet, but that's something that I will be doing at some point. It's definitely a Shakespeare play that I will come back to in the future. And last on the list, we're moving forward in time, but not all the way to the present, because I seem never to read any modern novels, but hey ho, we have Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So To the Lighthouse is the novel that actually made me like Virginia Woolf. I read Mrs. Dalloway as part of my undergrad, and to be honest, it may have been part of the reason why I dropped English and just stayed with philosophy. Although not the entire reason, I have to say. But To the Lighthouse I did really enjoy, and it does make me want to go back to Mrs. Dalloway at some point and reread it, because maybe I will appreciate it now that I'm not having to study it. It's a semi-autobiographical book that follows the Ramsay family and 2 visits that they make to a house that they have on the Isle of Skye in Scotland before and after the Second World War. But it's one of those stories that's not really about the plot, and is instead about the stream of conscious narration style that Woolf is very well known for and pioneered, and the way that she explores the characters in the family, their relationships with each other and their relationships with themselves. What I like about this book is that even though it is written in this modernist style, which can be verbose, complex and difficult to read, it manages not to fall into the trappings of being too austere to get any kind of pleasure or connection with the characters from. In fact, actually I would say it's quite an emotionally resonant story that it's told in the pages. And partly that's because Woolf just does a great job of bringing these characters and their internal dialogues and dilemmas to life. This is especially true of a character like Mrs. Ramsay, who is the matriarch of the Ramsay family. We have this woman who kind of plays the traditional role of a mother, and to some extent she's quite happy with that role, but then she also has her resentments because she's been held back, you know, to look after her family. She worries about her family, and so you just have this very complex character. But on the outside, she just appears to be kind of, you know, your typical maternal mother housewife type. But on the inside, there's this rich emotional life that Woolf does a really good job of bringing to life. And she does this with most of the other characters as well. And that's why I really enjoyed it. I just think that she really manages to dig deep into people's psychologies in a way that I haven't really found that often in, you know, your typical writing, because, you know, generally we focus on not so much the character's internal mind, but, you know, the things that they're doing and progressing the plot forward. I also really like the middle part of this book, where we move away from the stream of consciousness narration, and instead she moves to this kind of external perspective as she just kind of watches the passage of time while the family aren't in this house. It's during the war period. There are several family tragedies that occur in this period, and we just see the house that, you know, represents this family slowly collapsing and withering away with time, mirroring not only the destruction of the war, but also the destruction of the family that we saw in the first part of the book. So yeah, it's an excellent story. It's interesting, it's complex, it's got lots of things that you can look at and investigate in, but at its core, it's got some wonderful characters and Wolf does a really good job of bringing them to life. Alright, that's it for this list of the best things that I've read in 2021 so far. Let me know what you think of these books in the comments below, and let me know what the best things that you've been reading are so far this year. I look forward to talking with you about that in the comments, but until the next video, ta-ra!